Know this before you watch this video. The story I'm about to tell you is not from a novel. It happened in real life, in a real city, on top of the ancient walls of Istanbul. A 19-year-old named Semih Çelik becomes obsessed with a book called Kukla, Puppet, and starts copying the serial killer in that book into real life. First, he stabs a young girl to death in his home. Then he takes another young girl up on the city walls and tries to dismember her body the way it's described in that book. Hours later, he throws that girl's head down from the walls, right at her mother's feet. So how does an ordinary high school romance end like this? One book, dozens of messages, horrifying drawings. And this case ended with a decision of non-prosecution. Can you believe that? If you watch until the end, you'll hear the most disturbing truth in this file that no one talks about. These events are known, but there is information that has never been explained anywhere in the world, and we're going to talk about it in this video. A 19-year-old named Semih Çelik becomes obsessed with a book called Kukla and starts copying the serial killer in that book into real life. In this video, we are going to talk about exactly that. In October 2024, an incident took place in Turkey. An incident that took the breath away from millions of people. When something like this happens, the same thing always occurs. First, we see the striking headlines. He spread terror, the wall murder, the mysterious deaths of young girls. Everyone talks about it for a few days. Then the agenda shifts, and people move on to the next story. But this case did not fade away like a typical news wave. It stuck in people's minds. We all saw this file on national TV channels, on social media, in newspapers. But none of us knew the real psychological background of the event, how the details piled up and turned into this disaster. Because television tells shocking details for ratings, but most of the time it doesn't go deep into the question, why did this happen? That's exactly where this video comes in. You asked over and over again, when is the video about this case coming? We want to hear this from you. And so we decided to finally tell this extremely heavy case, with all its psychological breaking points, all its ignored signals, in full, naked detail. Today we're going to dive deep into the Semih Çelik case, the case publicly known as the Wall Murders, where horror and psychological collapse come together. We're going to talk about the brutality committed by a young man whose mind had completely fallen apart, Semih Çelik, and about the two young women whose lives were taken, Iqbal Uzunur and Ayşenur Halil. But let me say this clearly at the very beginning. This is not a story that can be summed up as a bad kid snapped and killed two people. If it were that simple, it wouldn't have carved itself this deeply into so many people's minds. This case is much deeper than it seems. Because this is not just about a murder, it's about how a person's mind collapses step by step, how the people around him fail to notice it, and how the system and society look away. And most importantly, this file contains one of the darkest examples of how psychological manipulation, obsessive attachment, and psychotic breakdown can drag young people along behind them. In the first part of this video, we're going to start the story from the very beginning. From Semih's high school years, his obsessive relationship with Iqbal, his withdrawal into himself during the COVID period, the first signs of his break with reality, the first fears of his family, and the signals that the doctors missed. We'll go through them one by one. Because a person doesn't become a killer in a single day. Mental collapse moves slowly, silently, and most of the time through small signs. And in this case, those signs were seen again and again. And again and again, they were ignored. In high school, people around him knew Semih as modest, introverted, but a decent kid. He prayed, fasted, had a certain religious sensitivity, didn't get into fights, and from the outside he did not look like a problematic person. In other words, he fit the model that society likes. A quiet, well-behaved, respectful young man who knows his place. But remember this. Some storms are invisible from the outside. That storm breaks not in the sky, but inside the skull. Inside Semih's inner world, a dark side was growing. He spent hours at the computer, games, videos, perhaps forums. As his connection with the outside world weakened, his inner world grew more powerful. When his family knocked on the door, he didn't want to open it. He was sending the message, "Leave me alone." The room door had effectively become the door to his mind. No one was allowed inside. These kinds of behaviors are signs of social isolation and emotional withdrawal. Yes, a normal teenager can also lock themselves in their room, but here's the difference. Semih hadn't made his room just a place to rest. He'd made it the center of his entire life. As the outside world was erased from his life, the scenario inside grew stronger. The family interpreted this as typical adolescence. He's young, he's withdrawn, he'll grow up and get over it, they thought. That's where the first big rupture happened. When the COVID period started, for someone already withdrawn like Semih, this process worked almost like an accelerator. Not going outside was now a requirement. Society was telling him to stay home, while he was already spiritually imprisoned at home. One day, his father entered the room. Even though it was freezing cold outside, the window was wide open. Semih was sitting there, watching outside, completely unaffected by the cold. Picture it. A silent room, the window open all the way. A young man sitting inside, eyes fixed far away. His father asks, "Son, why did you open the window? Aren't you cold?" Semih's answer is very simple, but unbearably heavy. "You can't see what I see." That sentence is a red alert for psychotic breakdown, the beginning of hallucination. In other words, the person sees, feels or hears something that does not exist in reality, but believes it is real. From that moment on, this is no longer just a case of an introverted young man. It becomes a matter of mental reality shifting. If that sentence had been taken seriously by a specialist in time, maybe we wouldn't be making this video today. But in that moment, it was brushed off as a weird thing he said, and life went on. During this process, his already obsessive relationship with Iqbal became more and more destructive. This relationship, which had started during high school years, might have looked like a normal teenage romance from the outside, but in Semih's mind, it had settled into a completely different place. Breakups and heartbreaks at young ages are, of course, normal. We all go through them. But in some personality structures, a breakup isn't just the end of love. It means the collapse of identity. For Semih, Iqbal wasn't just a girlfriend. She was the center of the obsessive world he had built in his mind. Losing her meant the collapse of that fictional universe in his head. The sentences he used and videos he sent to Iqbal make this clear. "If you had come out today, I would have killed you. You didn't, so your life was saved." From the outside, this sounds like a threat, but psychologically, this is the spoken form of psychotic paranoia and death fixation. In Semih's mind, love and death were in the same folder. If you loved someone, killing them could also be part of the script. At this time, Semih became obsessively attached to a novel called Kukla, Puppet. A normal person reads a book, gets affected, closes the cover, and goes back to their life. But for Semih, this book wasn't just fiction. It turned into the map of his mind. In the book, a serial killer murders people and makes a single puppet out of the pieces of the bodies. Heads, arms, legs taken from different people, all combine into one grotesque body. The charcoal drawings in Semih's notebook were almost identical to the drawings in the book. Sometimes the same poses, the same angles, the same postures. In psychology, this is called identification. A person identifies with a figure they admire, fear, or obsess over. They no longer just understand the character. They want to be that character. Semih was no longer just reading the novel. He was living it. This is a very critical threshold. The scribbles in his room, the drawings of dismembered bodies, female figures without heads, arms and legs cut off. These weren't just dark doodles. They were sketches for the scene he was preparing in his mind. And then the expected explosion came. 1st of March 2022. Semih drove a knife into his own heart on an empty football field. From the outside, this looks like a suicide attempt. But for some people with psychotic structures, this is an attempt to silence the voices inside. From a psychological standpoint, this behavior means, I don't want to live anymore in this body, with this mind. At that point, the person is not fighting the outside world, but the noise inside their own head. When he was taken to the hospital, Semih didn't say a single word to the doctors. Questions were asked, there were no answers. His gaze was frozen, his expression was shut down. This is evidence that the patient has completely closed off his inner world. In other words, he has effectively said, no one gets into my head anymore. But the system once again did not hear this scream. It was brushed aside with labels like adolescent psychology. He's young, he'll get over it. A diagnosis was put on paper. He was kept under observation for a few days, and then life supposedly continued as before. But in reality, life did not continue as before. It had already taken a different path. After the suicide attempt, it looked like Semih had cut off contact with Iqbal. The families thought the relationship was over. They believed, it's done, we're safe now, he'll turn a new page. But in truth, nothing had ended. It had only been moved deeper into the dark. Those videos and messages Semih had sent to Iqbal were still there. All those sentences starting with, "But if you had come out today," were still recorded somewhere. They weren't just threats from the past, they were a rehearsal of what would happen in the future. In 2023, Semih found a new girlfriend, Ayşenur Halil. From the outside, this might look like a normal new relationship. People say, he broke up, he found someone new, and move on. But in psychological terms, this is a replacement mechanism. The mind places a new target in the place of the old obsession. This new relationship did not calm the darkness in Semih's mind. It tied two different people to the same darkness. During this period, the charcoal drawings in his room increased. Severed arms, severed heads, dismembered bodies. Each drawing brought the mental image a little closer to reality. One day, his father went into the room and froze when he saw these pictures. Imagine that moment. A father walks into his son's room. Notebooks, walls, the top of the desk. Everywhere are drawings of dismembered human bodies. The father asks, "What are these, son?" Semih's answer is short, but sums up everything. "You wouldn't understand." That sentence shows that empathy is completely gone and that the mind has created its own fictional universe. Saying "you wouldn't understand" is another way of saying "I no longer live in your world." Around this time, Semih started working at a butcher shop. At first, the family interpreted this as he wants to work, he's using his hands, that's good. But when we analyze it psychologically, the real reason is much darker. Goal-oriented preparatory behavior. He was learning how to perform the cutting operations he would later carry out on his victims. Every piece of meat in the butcher shop was, in his mind, a physical rehearsal of the scenes from Kukla. At home, the knife set sat on the table and Semih would say, "No one is going to touch these knives." The family began living with these knives inside the house. And finally, when their fear reached its highest point, the mother and sister left the house. This wasn't an emotional tantrum, it was pure survival instinct. If you ask me, the father was also very afraid in that house. Honestly, I think he was locking his door when he slept. Wouldn't you be scared too? If someone like that were in my house, I couldn't sleep peacefully. And then we come to that day, the morning of the 4th of October. As usual, Ayşenur came to Semih's house that day. From the outside, this could have looked like just another ordinary meetup between two young people. But in Semih's mind, this day had been coded as the final day. We don't know exactly how long they stayed in the house, what they talked about. But we do know this. That day, Semih decided to finally turn the scenario he had been carrying in his mind for years into reality. On the couch where they were sitting, he began cutting into Ayşenur with the butcher's knives and dismembering her body. During Ayşenur's killing, Semih took a shower to wash the blood off, then went to a bakery and asked the baker, "How do I look? Do I look good?" All of this is a sign of emotional disconnection, a dissociative state. A normal person who has just killed someone would tremble, cry, panic. Semih, on the other hand, was in a surreal calm. Because in his mind, this was the scene that was supposed to happen. After that, Semih called the police, gave them the address and said, "A murder has been committed at the house, go there." And he himself took a taxi and went to the city walls. From a psychological perspective, this behavior is interpreted as completing the ritual. The first scene was played out in the house. The second scene required a specially chosen location, the walls of Istanbul. Iqbal's walk toward the walls appears completely voluntary in the camera footage. She's not being dragged, she's not trying to escape. The phone is in her hand, she's constantly talking to someone, she lifts her head and looks at the walls. She's trying to find her way. Psychologically, this is traumatic attachment. The victim has lost the ability to separate from the perpetrator. She has become emotionally attached to the very person she should be running away from. Iqbal was not taken there by force that day. That doesn't mean it was her fault. It means she had been sucked that deeply into Semih's mental vortex. They spent 4 to 5 hours together on top of the walls. Those hours were when the final scene was being written in Semih's mind. The conversations, the silences, maybe crying, maybe acceptance. None of it is recorded, but the outcome tells the whole story. Then her mother arrived. She had called her daughter's phone. An homeless man had answered and said, "It was thrown from the walls." A mother, running, out of breath, hands shaking, knees giving way, arrives at those walls, and Semih throws Iqbal's severed head at her mother's feet. This is an extremely rare psychotic outburst in human history. From a psychiatric point of view, this is called a hegemonic death scene. The perpetrator sees himself as the author of the entire process. He wants to end the story with an image that no one will ever forget. Then he tries to hang himself. He ties one end of the rope to the tower, loops the other end around his neck, and jumps. But the rope snaps. He doesn't fully hang. He hits the ground and dies on the way to the hospital. After the incident, when the phones were finally opened, shocking images came to light. Photos of Iqbal cutting her own body and sending the images to Semih, videos of her tightening a rope around her neck, naked photos over which Semih had drawn charcoal sketches of a body with the head and arms cut off. Messages saying things like, "Don't hurt me too much." This is a psychological collapse cycle in which two people are dragged into the dark together. After the horror on the walls, the opening of the phone records became the most critical turning point in this case. The public knew about the murders, but no one had guessed how deep the psychological dependency went. From a psychological analysis point of view, this behavior is called a double-sided deadlock cycle. The perpetrator is lost in his own darkness. The victim becomes the ground that feeds that darkness. In such situations, instead of fleeing from the perpetrator, the victim becomes more attached to them. This is not classic Stockholm Syndrome. It's much more fragmented, much deeper, a structure we call traumatic dependency. And that's why the forensic medicine report included this sentence. There are no signs of struggle under the nails. It is evaluated that they consented to the acts. That sentence shocked society. But for expert psychiatrists who followed the trajectory of this case, it was not surprising. The fact that Ayşenur's phone still hasn't been unlocked shows that the file actually hasn't fully closed. Officially, a non-prosecution decision may have been given up, but in reality, there are still many unanswered questions. If, in the future, the phone is decrypted and names of other people, other groups, different individuals Semih was messaging, influences, incitements emerge in the messages, then the file that we say closed today can be reopened tomorrow. Just like some cases that were closed years ago later came back onto the agenda with new DNA results. So even though this case is closed on paper, in reality it still sits there like an open wound. Here's the conclusion we should draw. Some murders are not committed by the collapse of one mind, but by the simultaneous collapse of two minds. And we can only understand this collapse not just through legal records, but with a psychological reading. Now let's go back to the walls again. The walls of Istanbul have witnessed scenes of war, death, invasion, defense, and loneliness throughout history. According to old police officers, the tops of the walls are among the most dangerous areas in terms of security. The homeless, addicts, thieves, secret meetings. Even the energy of this place feels heavy, and the fact that Semih specifically chose this area for murder shows that his inner world also matched that dark structure. In psychology, the choice of location is the outward reflection of the perpetrator's inner world. During those 4 to 5 hours on the walls, Semih was actually waiting to complete his ritual. He talked with Iqbal, preparing her for the final scene of the world he had created. Her mother's arrival was timed perfectly for the role she was meant to play in that final act. Because psychotic individuals often stage what they're living through as if it were a theatrical performance. Throwing Iqbal's head at her mother's feet was planned as the climax of the story. That behavior is not just an act of brutality, it's the ritualized final curtain of a mental collapse. The tragedy of the families is the most painful part of this story. Semih's family watched their sons collapse in plain sight and could not stop it. Neither the doctors heard their voices, nor did the system take them seriously. Ayşenur's family didn't even know their daughter was in such a relationship. Iqbal's mother perhaps felt, somewhere deep in her heart, that her daughter would die that day. Because sometimes a mother's intuition is stronger than any report. The reason society was so shaken by this event is not just the horror itself. It's seeing how fragile the human mind really is. When one person's mind collapses, everyone around them can be pulled into that collapse. A family is torn apart. 2 young girls lose their lives. A city falls into shock. This case teaches us this. When a human mind starts to collapse, it is not the police, not the family, not society that can stop it. If that collapse is not noticed and taken seriously in time, the price is always paid by the innocent. And what we've told today is the anatomy of one of the darkest events in Turkey's recent history. This is not just a murder story. It is the documentary of a psychological disaster. It is the account of how a madness grew step by step, and how signals that no one saw or no one wanted to see turned into a nightmare.